Hello everyone, we'll just let some people enter and then we'll get started. If you could leave yourself on mute, that'd be great. Thank you, because we've got 80 people joining us, perhaps more. Thank you. Okay, shall we get started as it's 7 o'clock? There might be a few more people joining us, but that's fine. So good evening everybody. My name's Carolyn Bryce and I run the operational side of the Compassionate Friends in the UK as Chief Executive of the charity. I want to extend a very, very warm welcome to you all to this first ever Inquest information evening hosted by the Compassionate Friends. Just a few small items of housekeeping before we continue with our evening together. Firstly, I'd want to remind you that we're recording this event so that those who weren't able to be here can listen at a later date. The recording will be publicly available on the TCF website and also on our YouTube channel. So your presence here indicates that you consent to this recording. Everyone's been muted, as we have 82 people joining us. Please would you keep your device on mute during our time together. That would be really helpful because otherwise it might get quite noisy. Just a little word about the chat box. So the chat, depending on what device you're using, the chat function is usually at the bottom of your screen when you click on participants. But we do ask you politely to that while our speakers are talking, you refrain as much as possible from posting in the chat box, as it can be really distracting for not only for the speaker but also for the audience. One way you can use the chat later on this evening is to ask questions after our speakers have spoken. So, and I'll be happy to field your comments, your questions to our speakers for their response if we have time today. So the fact that you are with us this evening, mostly, for most of you, most likely means that you have sadly experienced the painful and traumatic death of a son or daughter, brother or sister or grandchild. And it may be also that the death was unexpected or in particular circumstances, which means you're not only having to navigate your grief, but you have had to or will have to deal with legal processes, including an inquest. I want you to know that we all at Compassionate Friends feel for you, all of you that are here this evening, wherever you are in this grief journey and in this kind of legal process. We made the decision to offer this evening webinar as an inquest generally, is one of the topics our charity and particularly our volunteers are frequently asked about. We have hopefully put together a helpful evening for you, which offers you an overview of the inquest process, advice and suggestions about preparation, as well as an idea of what will happen on the day. Both our speakers are giving their personal perspectives. They're not in any way being prescriptive, they're simply sharing with you from their own learning, their own experience, and their own reflection about the inquest process. Our experience from previous online events we've run is that many here listening to our guest speakers may sometimes wish to share in the chat how they're feeling, something of what happened to their child or sibling, and perhaps particularly tonight want to share about the inquest for their own child, or for your own child or your sibling or your grandchild. But please, for the reasons I mentioned just now of distraction and also making sure we look after everyone in the Zoom room, we gently ask that you don't put too much or any specific detail or particularly graphic details in the chat box at all. We also want you to know that we appreciate that everyone is on their own individual journey. You'll be different places in your grief and will have very different experiences in relation to an inquest or other legal processes. And we appreciate that you may have very specific questions related to your own circumstances. We will have time after our speakers have spoken for your questions and comments. But we won't be able to comment, our speakers won't be able to comment on individual cases in this forum. So please can we respectfully ask you keep any questions quite general in nature about the process of inquest rather than specific to any one situation. And as I said before, because of the numbers here, it might be best if the questions are asked in the chat rather than verbally. As we might not be able to spot everyone anyway who wants to ask a question. Also, when we come to the question and answer part of the evening, please also note that we might not be able to answer every question or acknowledge every comment or give, as I said, individual responses. Instead, what we'll do is pick up mostly on kind of general themes that arise from your questions, and our speakers will be able to comment on those, hopefully. And finally, a reminder that we'll finish our evening together around 8 o'clock. Although Sefton Kwasnik, one of our speakers, does have to leave us at 7:55, but he's kindly said that if you email Compassionate Friends any questions that you have that he wasn't able to answer here, he will respond to you as soon as he can. So that's the preliminaries over and the introduction. So I now want to introduce our first speaker tonight, and that's Andrew Miller, QC. So Andrew is, many of you may know, but Andrew is a bereaved father. His son Fabian died aged 19 in January 2015. And Andrew began attending a TCF support group meeting about 5 months after Fabian's death, and I met him fairly quickly thereafter when he came to a TCF support weekend for parents in the early months and years of bereavement. He became an elected trustee and chair of our trustees in early 2020. And he's just coming, this is his final year of being a chair of trustees for Compassionate Friends. So through TCF, Andrew has also offered voluntary support to parents facing an inquest. And he co-facilitates the support group for bereaved parents and siblings in northwest London. In his professional life, Andrew has 30 years experience as a top-ranked commercial construction and insurance barrister and QC, and he now practices principally as a mediator. So thank you, Andrew, for coming to share your experience, your reflections as a bereaved parent having gone through an inquest, coupled with your legal expertise and knowledge with us tonight.
Thank you, Carolyn, and good evening to everyone. It really is quite something. There's 90 of us here, so that's absolutely incredible. Thank you for that introduction. I see quite a lot of familiar faces. Carolyn introduced me and told you who I am. Principally, I'm a bereaved dad. I'm Fabian's dad. I also happen to be a lawyer. And what you've got is two main speakers who are both lawyers, myself and Sefton, but I'm not here to give you any legal analysis at all. I'm here giving you my perspective, what I saw, partly because I was a lawyer, and I'll explain that, but what I saw as a bereaved dad, and what then led me, actually, once I got involved with volunteering for TCF, to talk to bereaved parents who are facing an inquest, rather than advise them, but to talk to them. So my background as a barrister, I started off, as all barristers do, in the type of work I do. Many end up representing parties in coroner's courts. So for the first few years of my practice in the early 90s, it was a very usual thing for me to be representing. More often than not, I was representing a driver who sadly had been involved in a fatal accident. And there was some day, in fact, there was one week in particular, I remember, when I did 5 inquests as a barrister. I never imagined that wine forward 20 plus years, that I would be in the position of the family, sitting there in a coroner's court. And Fabian, my son, was died, as Karen said. I wear his death on my sleeve. I talk about it very freely, and Fabian sadly died from drugs. And the inquest was at Westminster Coroner's Court, which, albeit was 20 years later, was very familiar to me. I'd been there on numerous occasions. And so we all went. I was quite fortunate in timing that the inquest was only 5 months after Fabian's death, and that can be quite fast. In fact, that is still quite fast for an inquest. And what happened at the inquest, what really shocked me, was when we were in the inquest, was me realizing how shocked everyone around me was, family and friends. And the reason they were shocked is because they had absolutely no idea what the inquest was going to be. They may have had a view in their own mind. And what I realized as someone who knew what the inquest was going to be, I hadn't explained it to them. And so what I saw was, I had my own trauma of going through the inquest for the loss of Fabian. But what I saw in effect was what I would call unnecessary trauma of parents, siblings going through an inquest simply because they didn't know or what to expect or what was going to happen. And so that's why I put myself out to help people. So most of it, I don't represent parties at an inquest. So most of what I do is I talk to them on the phone. And what I start with is actually telling them about what in fact a coroner's court is, because it puts it into context. And the coroner's court, actually, I had a look at, and in some form, it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. But in its current form, it's actually quite old. It goes back a few hundred years. And the coroner's court was there was of most significance going back, if you imagine, let's go back 200 years, for example, when it's perhaps hard to imagine, but more people, for example, died of horse and cart accidents than die on our roads now every year. More people died of illness. And what they needed was a system of being able to register these deaths and the reasons. And so the coroner's court had to determine 4 things. And those 4 things were who died, where they died, when they died, and the final one is how they died. And that hasn't changed. That's what the coroner's court is there for. And it still does that in its present form. And it sort of begs the question in a lot of cases, because you can imagine if you went back 200 years, they didn't always know who died. They didn't necessarily know where they died, or in fact, when they died, or how. So there was this, these questions over the death that had to be solved. Now, there are still deaths, of course, where there are big question marks. But in most cases, the who, where, when, and even in most cases, the how are known. And so it really begs the question as to why there is still an inquest. And if I take lost my father a few years ago in his 80s, there was no issue as to the who, where, when, and how. the doctor simply signed off on all of those, and there was no inquest. And there may well be some of you in the audience who did not have an inquest for the loss of their child and sibling. But where there is any possible doubt or issue, or not even doubt, there will probably be an inquest. So in the case of my son, who we know who died, we know where, we know the when, and we know the how because of the pathology report. So again, why was there an inquest? Well, the simple reason was because he was 19. And that is almost a knee-jerk reaction to go to an inquest. Was there anything that came out at the inquest that was different about those 4 questions? No. Did there have to actually be one to answer those questions? No, but it was held. So it tends to be, if a young person is involved, it's almost automatic that there will be, even if they can answer those questions. If there are issues of medical or clinical malpractice, negligence, there will be one. Generally speaking, road traffic cases tend to be. It's if there's a sudden and unexpected death. But whatever the reason, and I'm talking about most of them, and I'm going to leave Sefton, who actually deals with the really technical ones, and there are really technical ones. But in most cases, they go through a similar format. And it's understanding that point that I'd wish I'd explained, that this process was a formal process that the law dictates has to be undertaken if a doctor has not signed off on those 4 questions, or if a coroner deems it to be necessary for there to be an inquest. It's the fact that I hadn't explained that it was this formal process. So I think and when I talk to parents, what I say to them, having explained that, is you're going into this formal process. You're going to be one of many families going through it, and if it's not a very complicated one, and some people have inquests that last days in very complicated cases, where there are issues of third parties, and I'll come back to those. If it's a case which, as in the case of Fabian, my son, it's a case that we dealt with in about 45 minutes. And there can be several on the day. You can arrive at a coroner's court and there can be listed 10 like that. And the word that's often forgotten, which really sums up, and I know one of the family members attending said, I had no idea it was going to be a court. Now the clue's in the name, coroner's court. But you go into this absolutely formal setting of a court where the coroner is sitting as a judge would sit, up on a higher platform, where you are sitting as, whether there's lawyers there or not, in the seats lower down. And so a really important thing, if anyone is asking what's going to happen, is to understand that formality that you're going into. And the reason is because it's very cold. And I don't just, sometimes they can be very cold temperature-wise, but it is a very cold atmosphere. And what you have is a coroner where, pausing there are good coroners, really good coroners, and not so good coroners. But they are very busy individuals who on any given day could be seeing 10, 20 different inquests, going through 20 different types of death. And so people often say, I didn't feel any empathy from the coroner. I didn't feel any warmth. And that's one of the things I say, don't expect. You may get a coroner who is incredibly busy, incredibly overworked. And for them, they're not you. They're not the family. They're not the parents. They're not the siblings, their grandparents. They have a job to do and to go through it. And they are going through the formality, whether they're going through the evidence, however it is, whether it's just on paper, as it was in my case. There were no live, no individuals giving evidence live. It was all on paper. And it was going through simply so the coroner could answer those questions: who, where, when, and how. And that's what I say to parents and to siblings I speak to is, if you know what you're going, if you understand the process you're going to go into, if you have some sort of familiarity with what's going to happen, it will never make it easy, but it will make it easier. And the thing is knowing that those are the 4 main points that a coroner is going to decide. It leads to the next bit, because very often, for whatever reason, parents or siblings or whoever are expecting to get answers at an inquest. Now, there are, as I say, very technical inquests. There are inquests concerning a medical malpractice, etc., where there may be witnesses giving evidence, there may be cross-examination, etc. But most inquests are this straightforward and quite short. And what I always say to parents when I'm talking to, I had lots of questions, but the only person who could have answered those questions was Fabian. And Fabian couldn't answer them, obviously. He was no longer with us. And so whatever questions you may have, they may not be answered. And there's a high probability that questions that you have, you won't get answers at an inquest. And that applies even, because the inquest, when going back to where I started, when I represented in people, the inquest where there were questions to be asked and perhaps answers to be given, they may not be given in the inquest. So there may be evidence that you'd like to be heard, that isn't going to be heard. And so for me, the overriding thing is, that I say to parents is, it's never going to be a good experience. It's never going to be a good experience going through an inquest about the loss of your child, your sibling. But if you have high expectations of what is going to happen, it's probably going to be even more distressing. So let me just give you a few things that I found were useful and actually had taken in. Yeah. The one thing was that I knew that inquests could take a long time to happen. Why Fabian's inquest, it was actually listed initially 4 months after. Why it was delayed 1 month because of court availability. Why it was so quick, and that was quick, I don't know. But I know, speaking to most parents, and I'm sure it's got a lot worse with COVID, people can wait a long time. I was speaking to a family that waited over 3 years for an inquest, and that is incredibly frustrating. I know that dealing with the coroner's office is equally frustrating. I had to deal with them on a couple of occasions. It's a nightmare to get through. And it's very hard because I was in the very, very early stages of grief to understand why the person answering the phone wasn't full of empathy for me. And the reason was simple. I can see it now because they are answering the phone non-stop to bereaved family after bereaved family. But it is a difficulty. And again, if you have the knowledge that this is going to be difficult, it can help. So they can take a long time to come. It can be frustrating. Of course, it can be upsetting. The issue, and Sefton is going to be the person to talk about this because this he does. Yeah. There is always a big question of, do I need representation at the inquest? And that depends. There's no exact answer on that. Yeah. It depends on the individual circumstances. And I think as a general rule, what I say to parents is, if there is third party involvement, whether it's medical profession, whether it's a road traffic accident, something like that, and there are real questions that may be asked, they may not be answered, but they may be asked at an inquest, or maybe should be asked, or there is a want to have certain people at an inquest, right, then getting legal representation is a good thing. But there are many inquests, and my son's inquest was one of them, where there was no point. There was no other, there were no third parties involved. We knew the answers to the 4 questions quite crystal clear before we went into the inquest. There was no medical issue in terms of before, during, or after. It was Fabian alone, and so there was no need. But sometimes individuals want to have a lawyer there, or just someone maybe slightly removed from the family to be there to help them to get through the day, and that's important. But I'm going to tell you the thing I say to everyone, whether they have representation or not. Right? The one thing that seems to be common in all inquests, whether you have representation or not, is the coroner will ask for a statement from the parents, maybe the siblings. And they may ask you to put certain things in it. And what happened was there were questions that we were asked about Fabian's history of taking drugs, different things going on, etc. And what I knew was there was a possibility that this statement would be read out. Right? And so what I did with Fabian's mother was we sat down and we wrote a statement about Fabian. And it wasn't to do with how he had died. It was about him. It was about who Fabian was. Nothing to do with the death, except bits about the pain, the shock, etc., the family. And there was a reason we did that, and the reason, and this did go back to my experience. I knew in Fabian's case the press would be there. And so I knew that this would get into the press. And by writing the statement as we wanted to say it, and this was one of the reasons why I had to speak to the coroner's officer, was I said I wanted either myself or the coroner to read out that statement. And what we achieved, because it did get, my son's case got a lot of press coverage, what it achieved was we gave the journalists the story. And the story was about Fabian. It wasn't about why he died, how he died, the situation. Of course, they put bits in there that we preferred would not have been in there. But we controlled the narrative. And that's quite difficult. So it's quite difficult to do, especially when you're in your bereaved state. But whether you have every death is a tragedy, but I'm going to use this word, and I don't mean to use it, an uncontroversial inquest, as I'd say ours was, or a very controversial one because of third parties. If you can put together a statement about your child, about your sibling, and insist, whichever way you want to put it, that it is read out, the press will take that. Journalists just want fodder, and if you give it to them, it's easy. And so that's the other thing you have to deal with. On the press, I made a point, having done that when we left the court, I wasn't going to make any comment. There were about 6 press outside. They took photos and we left. We'd made our point in the statement. And so I say to parents, personally, I didn't think it was worth, I was not in a good state. No one was in a good state. It wasn't a good time to start talking to journalists. What you may find, and it's just to be aware, because that came as a shock to others in the group, is that especially if it's a young person, if it's a death in a certain manner, in my case, drugs, you are likely to have press interest there and to be there. So I'm going to finish on that. I will take some questions, but I say Sefton is going to then really come in and help us as to when it really is important to have representation there. So thank you everyone for listening, and I hope that's helpful to some of you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. That was such a helpful, clear outline of actually what an inquest is, and suggestions and thoughts and perspectives from your own experience being at an inquest before you were bereaved, and sadly being taking part as a bereaved parent. So thank you so much. Really, I found that really helpful and enlightening, actually, in many ways. So Andrew will take questions afterwards, but after we've heard from Sefton. But I just want to introduce you now to Sefton Kwasnik, who is a very special friend of TCF, actually. He's been supporting our charity and its members for many years with his expertise. I think it must be 15 years, maybe more. So by way of introduction to Sefton, he qualified as a solicitor in 1981, and he has huge experience across criminal law defence, inquest representation and serious accidents. He's represented many families at inquest and advises on issues that sudden or any death may raise. He also has extensive experience dealing with the police throughout his professional career. He has advised and represented many members of the Compassionate Friends at inquest, helping with many different concerns, like getting full information around the circumstances, speaking to police, concerns about the way investigations are carried out, difficulty receiving information from the coroner, all those many other different kind of issues that he's helped bereaved families with. So Sefton's relationship with TCF is quite unusual in that we don't usually signpost or quote recommend commercial companies and so on, but we make an exception as Sefton has helped so many TCF families, offering assistance with many of the issues that I've outlined, and just generally easing the strain on parents and families by listening and, if appropriate, making formal inquiries on their behalf. Sefton's currently director of Ozon Solicitors, who are based in Greater Manchester, and he's going to speak a little bit more about some of the legal issues around inquests. And we really thank him for giving his time to be with us this evening. So Over to you, Sefton.
I hope my microphone's working, and I just wanted to say at the outset that I've found it a real privilege to help so many different families at different stages of their grief, largely with an inquest as a common denominator. And what I have found, without exception, is that the family members that I speak to have an unquenching thirst to understand every single facet and every single reason, cause, and contribution of how their loved one came to pass. And from my experience, the coroner process can be of assistance to secure some, if not all, of that information. But what I try to do for families is to walk with them on the journey in line with one of the themes and mottos of the founder of the Compassionate Friends, which is that you need never walk alone. And I will try and help and support families to get to the root of the information that they so often crave, and that I find is quite frequently buried, covered up, hidden, masked, not provided. And just as an example, only last week I did a 4-day inquest, and we were getting new evidence whilst the witnesses were actually speaking. And false evidence was given on oath by a police officer to a direct question. I've been asked to cover separate topics in my talk, and I'll try to cover those to give you a range of areas where help can be given. And one of the questions I was asked to cover was, are there things that I can do or should do before the inquest? And it's quite a wide question. As you've heard from Andrew, the actual hearing date for an inquest will be several months after the date of the death. I also find that family members get a bit confused sometimes between an inquest and a post-mortem. It's not unusual for some people to confuse the two, but just for the avoidance of doubt, the inquest is the hearing, the post-mortem is the medical ability to ascertain the clinical cause of death, and the post-mortem will be performed usually within days of the death. And as a matter of information, each family member should be notified by the coroner of when the post-mortem is to take place, and what is more, each family member has an absolute right to arrange for their own doctor to attend the post-mortem. Achieving that is nigh on impossible, but families do have those rights. But the question I was being asked to answer is, are there things that I can or should do before the inquest? Well, reverting to my original comment about the thirst to obtain information, one of the issues that occurs to me is that there may be, other than the coroner, sources of information, routes to information that may assist families gain some help, some knowledge as to what happened. And two very obvious sources of help can be the paramedics who attended if the death was, an ambulance was called. Each time an ambulance is called, a paramedic report is completed, and generally the ambulance service will release the paramedic report to the family upon request. And that quite often provides helpful information, will often contain comment on the history of the presenting circumstances, sometimes captures information from third parties at the scene, and it can be a good source to get information. Equally, if the fire brigade attended, they also will release a fire report. Similarly, other agencies may also have information that can assist, such as the Health and Safety Executive or other investigative agencies of the state. And I've often found that that information finds its way onto these records that you get earlier than through a coroner, or you don't get from the coroner whatsoever. But things that you can do or should do before the inquest, first and foremost, you need to try to get yourself into a strong emotional space, which is, I understand, quite difficult. But try to prepare yourself mentally and emotionally for what is not necessarily going to be an easy journey, and one that can be fraught with obstacles in getting yourself the information that you need. So try to get yourself in a position of strength so that you can try and deal with the bureaucracy that Andrew has talked about. I once helped a family who lived in the northwest of England. Their inquest was in Truro, and the coroner had an obligation to share the statements with the family. And in that particular instance, the coroner said to me on their behalf, oh yes, they can have the information, but they'll have to come to court to get it. And I'm not going to let them have a copy. They'll have to read it and go away. And strictly that complied with his duty. But the reality was requiring mid-aged parents who'd lost a daughter at uni, they would have had to have undertaken a 700-mile round trip. I persisted with my determination to avoid that. The coroner was removed. They got the information in the post or on email. But if the family hadn't had professional help, they would have got nothing at all. So I try to help because I can, and I try to help because there's no obvious outlet for people to get help or signposting even for help. Which leads me into the second question of, should I get legal assistance? Well, again, as Andrew has said, there are no two death-related investigations that are the same. And in some instances, there may not be a need to get legal help. But in others, there may be a compelling need to get legal help. And I think, as Andrew touched upon, there may also be a sort of psychological or emotional need for somebody to literally hold your hand and, as I said before, walk the same steps with you, somebody who knows what they are doing. I can change a light bulb, but I can't put in a new lighting system. So I will call an electrician to help me with that. And it's no different really in this process. It's a completely different environment to your everyday experience. And the system is under so much pressure that coroners and their staff don't like, as Andrew has said, having to work, having to answer queries. So they try to discourage families from engaging with detailed questions. But in my experience, families have a right to know, and they have a right to press their requests to know. And this is actually recognised in the coroner's rules, because they provide an absolute right for anybody who is regarded by the court as what is known as an interested person, and an interested person in relation to their loved one will be a parent, a brother, a sister, a wife, a mother, or anyone else who can show a close connection to their loved one. In some instances, an interested person can actually be an insurer who may have to be paying out on a policy associated with the loved one. So if someone attains what is known as interested person status, and rights are automatic in family instances, then that right confers with it an absolute right to get the information the coroner will have available to them well in advance of the hearing, so that you don't go in unprepared. You are entitled to see the evidence that the coroner is going to rely on, the photos that they may be seeing, the body cam images from the police if they're available, and all other materials. And you're entitled to object to statements simply being read to an inquest, providing you've had the statement in advance and there is valid reason why you wish to object to that statement simply being read. So if you want to ask questions of a witness and show reason why the statement is challenged, that should be allowed. And so the need to get representation will often be governed by the circumstances of your loved one's passing and your ability to easily obtain the information you need. But legal support can facilitate that possibly more effectively than an individual who may not quite know how to ask the right question, or perhaps is overwhelmed and bewildered by the bureaucracy involved. The next question that I've been asked to comment on would probably take me a week to answer. And the question is what to expect at the inquest and what not to expect. And the only real thing I can say by that is, even if you've gone through all of the process of trying to get in advance the information, you have to expect the unexpected, because it happens. And unfortunately, it happens with or without legal representation, and it happens more frequently than it should. And there's very little that can be done to prevent it. But if you are facing the unexpected, it may be easier for you to face that with a professional who can try to address the points of the unexpected. So just turning upon last week's experience, during the course of that case, as it unfolded, new evidence was seen for the very first time whilst witnesses were giving evidence. It shouldn't have happened, but it did. The coroner included in her own bundle statements that the family hadn't been given. And the coroner said, oh, well, we thought we'd sent that, but they hadn't. No one else had received them. There were other interested persons, including a local authority. And so whilst you can prepare as best you can to avoid surprises, unfortunately, you have to expect the unexpected. Hopefully it won't happen, but just be aware of the fact that it may. The last topic would also take a long time, but and this is one that may prompt individual queries from any of you, or any of you who are have been in situations or going through a situation, or know people who are going through a situation, such as legal and technical issues at the inquest. If you have specific queries on any topic, if you can send them on email or chat, I will respond to them on an individual basis outside the scope of this particular forum this evening. But there are legal and technical issues. Often they are dealt with ahead of the hearing. So in longer inquests or more detailed inquests, the coroner will generally hold what is called a pre-inquest review hearing, which is like a planning hearing to decide various issues, such as what will the scope of the inquest be? How far back will we delve into the events that culminated in the loss of our loved one. And there can often be territorial discussion with the family saying, well, something happened 3 years ago that might have been a trigger to what then wasn't picked up on. And if the someone that did something 3 years ago was a local authority, was a medical authority, was an agency of some sort, you can rest assured that they will be saying, oh no, we want a much narrower inquest than that. We should only be focusing on the last few weeks of the loved ones involved in an inquest where, in advance of a pre-inquest review, a coroner had set the scope, which was to look at various elements of the loss of the loved one, including pastoral care from a university. And he had received a detailed report from the university in regard to that topic. So we assumed at the pre-inquest review that that would be rubber stamped. It's already been set out. We didn't address it. We simply said, in advance of the pre-inquest review, we want the author of the report to come to court. So guess what? The coroner chose to abandon the report altogether because it didn't suit his purpose. The university were being brought into disrepute because of their lack of pastoral care, and he just abandoned it. And so the family had a two-pronged inquest before the pre-inquest review, and after the pre-inquest review, it was a one-pronged inquest. And in that particular instance, the family sought advice to try to challenge the decision by way of judicial review, and the coroner said, do what you want, I'm carrying on. And that's exactly what he did. So there can be various technical issues that arise on the journey to the final hearing, and you would be very well advised to seek legal advice if you think you have legal and technical issues on that road. Now, I could go on, but I know time is limited and my own time is limited this evening. I hope that I've been of some constructive help to those who are in this audience. It's very flattering that there's such an attendance. I've seen one or two names that I recognise from my history and association with the Compassionate Friends, and for those that I've helped in the past, I say a hearty, a warm hello, and for those that I haven't met, I equally say thank you for listening to me this evening. And if there's anything I can do going forward, I will only be too pleased to help you. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I'll need to disappear in a very short time. Thank you.
Okay, Sefton, thank you so much. Thank you for your, really helpful perspective from your long experience as a legal professional helping bereaved families. There's lots of questions. We have got some time. Are people happy to go on for 10 or 15 minutes? And then, yeah, okay. All right, so just taking some of the questions that I've noted down here. Do either Andrew or Sefton, if you're still here, if you're able to answer them. And I also noticed we've got Beverly Radcliffe, who's the CEO of the Coroner's Court Support Service, who I will mention later in my summing up and with other charities that offer support around inquests and legal processes. So Beverly, if you want to contribute, that's fantastic too, from your experience. So one of the questions is, do statements get read out at the inquest? And do details of how my son died get read out in detail?
Well, if I can just answer this before I disappear.
Yeah.
Statements get read out if they're not challenged, but if they're challenged, then the witness who makes the statement will appear in court, so the evidence will still be given. I think everyone needs to understand that the court is a public hearing, that the public are entitled to be there, and indeed the law demands that the coroner sits in public. And during COVID, a number of coroners, including one in a case I did, sat in private. We only found out that the coroner was sitting in private when the coroner's dog started to bark, when the coroner's car was being returned from being serviced. And the strict rule was that a private hearing is unlawful. So I'm afraid a court is a public place, and any information that is presented to the court will be heard publicly and can be communicated publicly. And providing it's reported accurately, there is nothing can be done. So if I can bow out now, because I've got a competing commitment to collect someone from a train coming from London. If I don't meet that train, I may not be around for the next Zoom meeting. But thank you all once again for allowing me to speak, and I hope I've contributed in some small way to your knowledge.
Thanks, Sefton.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And as I've put in the chat, how to contact Sefton if you've got specific questions. So shall we just...
Can I just deal with that then very briefly? Because
Yeah.
Sefton has made the point that, as I said, it's a court, it's in public. It goes back to what I said. Everything, there is a chance that anything and everything that is relevant to the death will be read out. There are some things that the coroner may read to themselves, but they have to, as it's public, actually, for example, read out what it is in the pathology report, etc. So they might say that if members of the family want to leave the court before we read this out, but it will be read out. And it comes back to my point. It's very easy for journalists to pick up on the gory details if the death does have gory or salacious details. And that's why I said, my advice to parents is write something about your siblings, write something about your child and sibling that if it's going to get in the press, that you would prefer. But yes, it comes down to the who, when, where, and the how. That's the evidence that has to be given.
Thank you, thank you. There's a question here about the 4 aims of do coroners have a responsibility to also investigate fully in order to prevent future deaths? Is that one of the aims of a coroner's court, to prevent future deaths?
It's certainly not the aim. The aim of the coroner's court is simply to answer those 4 questions. There are, in the cases that involve third parties, a party can make an application, and the second so he'd tell us that the coroner makes a recommendation. They don't have to, but it can happen, but they are few and far between. So parents often say, well, I want the coroner to say that what this hospital did was terrible, that the lack of provision of mental health care to my son, daughter, sibling wasn't good enough. It's rare that they will make that sort of notice. It does happen, but it is rare. And so again, it comes down to this expectations. It's better to have an expectation that it won't happen. But what a coroner is not there for in those questions, there's no why. It's who died, where they died, when they died, and how they died, not why they died. And so the why is a huge question for us. It's a huge question for bereaved parents and siblings. It's not generally a huge question for inquest. So people often, the Hill often talk about, and what's their exposure to inquest, the Hillsborough inquest that went for weeks, if not months, I can't remember how long. That wasn't how inquests normally are. That was actually, I'd call that an inquiry. It was almost, and that went far, far, far beyond what you would normally see in your everyday in a coroner's court.
Thank you, thank you. There's a couple of other questions. When do we get to get the pathologist report or the post-mortem report? How long, you know, when do families get that? Do they get that? How do they get it? How long are third parties given to provide that information? And do families have to chase the coroners for these reports prior to inquest?
We weren't provided with the autopsy or the pathology report, but I knew there was one, and I only got it when I phoned up to be provided. And what, as Sefton said, any interested, and it's a horrible phrase, but any interested party is entitled to. What I've seen helping parents is a lot of the time they're not sent out to parents until they ask for them. So you may get some coroner's court, Westminster was not one of them, where it was automatic that they're sent out. And that can come as a huge shock to members of the family, because they suddenly receive an envelope, they don't know what's in it, and they're suddenly reading about a pathology report. In my case, I only got it when I asked for it, and then they didn't send it to the right address. They actually sent it to Fabian's mum, who didn't want to see it. So it's a really, really difficult one. So there's no straight answer to it, but if it's something you want to see and you don't have it, you can request it. I have heard of instances, and I've had parents telling me that there has been a refusal. In one example, I remember a coroner's in the office told a parent, our coroner has a policy of not sending these reports to bereaved parents. There's no law for that. There's no right to do that. And I told them, if you want to see it, just effectively write again and say, please send it immediately. And it was sent with them, or sent to them.
Thank you, thank you. I'll just share two more questions. Is that okay? Because I know we've gone over the 8 o'clock. Is everyone happy?
Does Claire want to say something?
Yeah, sorry, yes, and Claire. Claire, did you want to comment from a sibling point of view?
Well, sorry, I just left you a sort of a bespoke message, Carolyn, just to say that in comparison, we were able to get the report very easily. And I suppose I just wanted to make that point that I think, I mean, just from my personal experience, sorry, just to give a bit of background, my brother died in 2016. In May, and we didn't have the inquest until July 2019, and it took place over 3 days. So it was very messy in terms of, well, it got postponed several times. So I really have so much sympathy for the people who I've seen in the chat saying that the inquests have been postponed, because it is very painful. And I was just making the point by making that comment to Carolyn that and Andrew has made it clear as well that it can vary so much from case to case. And so not for all of the questions that have been asked, I don't have a legal background or anything like that. So I just know from my experience. I think that I don't think there's one way that each coroner's court sort of deals with these things. And, you know, we were lucky, we had a very sympathetic coroner, and he was very fair. But, you know, a lot of the concerns that people seem to have in the chat, you know, were did happen to us, things were read out that we would rather they not have been read out. We actually, the reason why it took so long was that there was some questions about the treatment that my brother got within the hospital he was in. So we actually did have an element of, I don't know, it was very surreal, almost like an American court case, whereby we had people saying that's not how it was and bad mouthing my brother who they'd never met, obviously. And it was very not what I was expecting at all. So what Andrew and Sefton were saying about expect the unexpected, that is something I would reiterate. So yes, that was all I really wanted to sort of say. Really just to say that every experience, I imagine, is very, very different. And something else I just wanted to say, just from the siblings' perspective, just that if you can share your grief and the pain that you're going through with people, so that you're not in an echo chamber. I don't mean to be insensitive, but I found that so hard to see my mum not talk to people about it because she was ashamed. It was so hard for me to go through all that with her, knowing that she wanted to keep things under wraps, and the pain of worrying about it getting out was so difficult. But anyway, I digress. That would be just my only piece of advice from, I'm so sorry to you all for your loss. But yeah, as Sefton said, suggested as well, if anyone has anything I've said triggered something, or you have any questions, feel free to put them to Carolyn, and who can pass them on to me. But I'm only here as from a personal perspective, so I appreciate that might not be helpful.
Thanks, Claire.
Thank you, Claire. Claire is a trustee of Compassionate Friends, and as she said, a bereaved sibling. Okay. I think probably the best thing is that we finish our meeting here today. I know there are lots and lots of questions on the chat, and lots of things that you want to share and discuss. But I think probably we've probably come. I know this is very useful. We'll probably need to come to an end now for the evening.
Carolyn, can I just point one thing out? Beverly Radcliffe, thank you very much for attending. Has put it much more concise than I could, and that it goes back to that question of what a coroner can do. And one of the things, as she points out, is that there is this legal obligation on a coroner to write a preventing future deaths report. That was the phrase I couldn't remember, where the coroner believes that action should be taken to prevent future deaths. And that happens, but it doesn't happen with huge regularity, as far as my experience has shown. And so parents who come to me will often say, well, my solicitor has mentioned this, and I'll say there is nothing, given the circumstance, there's nothing wrong with the solicitor asking for that, or your barrister asking for that in court. But it goes back to the expectation. The coroner may not consider that the case warrants a future death report. And it doesn't, what then happens with that anyway, doesn't change anything. So thank you, Beverly, for doing that. I know, Karen, you're going to give a pointer to Beverly's charity and give assistance for people going through inquests. Absolutely. So I just first of all want to thank our speakers, Andrew Miller and Sefton Kwasnik, and also Claire Coveney, for giving her experience from a bereaved siblings perspective. And we really hope that tonight's event has been useful to you or helpful to you in some way, and that you've been able to find some useful information and support from hearing the views and perspectives of our speakers, and also those who've asked questions and made comments. I just wanted to remind you that the Compassionate Friends publish a number of helpful publications around the whole subject of inquests and legal processes.
We've got 3 fact sheets, which Stephen's now just putting into the chat, the links which you could copy and paste so that you can access them. They're on our website. 3 fact sheets giving an overview of the inquest process, advice on preparation and what happens on the day. Also, we've got information on about Scotland and Northern Ireland and the processes, the legal process there, which differ slightly or sometimes quite significantly to England and Wales. So again, you can find information there and on our website under legal help. And we also have on our website the document that the Ministry of Justice has published in 2020, which is called A Guide to Coroner Services for Bereaved People. We also publish a leaflet, Coping with Legal Proceedings, which again Stephen has put the link into the chat, hopefully. And this looks at some of the legal processes and issues that can arise for us as parents and family members before, during and after legal proceedings. It focuses more on what unfolds and the sort of emotional impact of those procedures on us as bereaved family members. And yes, I wanted to mention 2 charities actually and organisations that offer specific support. The first is the Coroner's Court Support Service, and I've put the website details into the chat, and I think Beverly has too. It's a voluntary service for anyone attending an inquest at a coroner's court. I think, Beverly, you're in over 50% of coroner's courts in England and Wales. They offer, the CCSS offer practical and emotional support while you're at the coroner's court, and the volunteer will take you into the court before the proceedings start and explain everything. They have a wonderful helpline which if you have questions about inquests or any of the procedures and the proceedings, they can help. So please access support from them. And the other organisation is called Inquest. It's a charity providing expertise on state-related deaths and their investigation. And they include deaths, for instance, in police and prison custody, immigration detention, deaths in mental health settings, and deaths involving multi-agency failings, or where wider issues of state and corporate accountability are in question. So it's quite specific. But they have worked around the Hillsborough, for instance, disaster and the Grenfell Tower fire. So that's another organisation. And on our website, under other helpful organisations in the legal section, there's details of some local charities and organisations that help around in local areas or on specific types like road deaths, particular types of death. So have a look at that as well. And a huge thank you to Beverly for being with us and helping us, helping you and supporting you during this evening. So I just want to say in conclusion, really, to remind you that we're all at different points in grieving and our journey. And it's really important, particularly after a session like this, where we all can take time to look after ourselves and wrap yourself in a bit of self-care and compassion after this session, as it may have stirred, well, I'm sure it has stirred, strong emotions or feelings about your child, grandchild or sibling's death and the legal process that you've faced or are still to face. So please look after yourself and be as kind to yourself as you can. So huge thanks to Andrew and Sefton for taking the time to talk to us tonight and to answer your questions and comments. And thank you all of you for your important and relevant questions. And if you've got others, please direct them either to us and we'll pass them on to the info@tcf.org.uk email, or please get in touch with the Coroner's Court Support Service helpline, which is on their website. So take good care of yourself just now after listening tonight, and particularly in the coming hours and days. And a very, very good night to you all. And please do leave the Zoom room in your own time when you wish.